we're picking up where we left off. That video had stopped in error just as I was working into the water. So now what happened is, in that interim time, the 5 minutes, I just laid the basic sketch in for where the tree is going to fill that whole middle ground from right to left. Now I'm going to pause on that. I'm not going to work on the tree right now because I still want to do things into the background. By the way, I did put a coat of glaze over that, I shouldn't say glaze, a coat of the gloss medium. So that way it has a coat that evens. It's also building up some transparencies in terms of layers for the light to penetrate and reflect back. So I'm going to work into the water. Remember, we're working from as though you had gone to this place and worked sketches and you had a sense of it and you brought, generally I bring a lot of photos, but we're working with this one. I can see that background behind this tree is going to end up filling a lot of this panel. But I still want to do a little more into the background, and I want to work on the water before I get too carried away with the tree. One of the things I do a lot, I flipped it upside down only because I see that there's some trees in that background, and I tend to like to work so that my stroke is going in the direction almost of the growth. So I'm going to dip a little ink. I still have that same palette going. Off my palette, I'm grabbing some of that glazing liquid, what keeps it from drying slowly. I can see that those trees that are in the background are a little bit dim. It's called atmospheric perspective, where you're seeing the color as less clear. So I'm getting a brush load of that brown. I had the ink brown, and now I want to lighten it. So I'm going to just take a little bit of the white. And I'm looking at what I see there, and I'm looking at what I have here. I'm just going to grab a little bit more white. So I have a fairly pale, and I'm just going to suggest, because I see that in that background there are some trees. So I'm going to just pull, don't like that brush. Let's see, I'm looking through what I have laying here, and I have hundreds more in the backup. I'm working with one of those riggers or scripts. I'm rolling that through the paint. If I'm trying to get a nice controlled line, I want to load the brush so that it stays with a point. I'm holding my hands. There is a tool when I work upright, standing on a bigger easel. I'll use one of these mauls to hold my hands. But at this point, I'm going to just hold my hand. That helps me to steady. You may have a steady hand. So I'm just going to suggest where some trees are in the background there. And I'm trying to pull my stroke the way a tree grows. And again, we're not cameras. So I want the gestures of the tree. I don't necessarily need that, what I'm doing, to be this exact replica of that tree that happens to be in the photos. But I do see there's a variety back there. So I'm just going to get some of those in. Notice how faded this value is. It appears that there's some kind of a branch coming that's overlapping some of these. I don't see a branch going this way, but I think it's going to make more sense. And that may be all I do, because I don't really see a lot more down back there. That tree line that I had in, I need to get a little bit more of a sense of foliage on it. So I just reached over and I grabbed a full brush load of green gold. If I don't have green gold, remember that's that one color that I strongly recommend, and I have it in a container because I tend to buy a lot of these. It's a little less costly, but you buy that 2-ounce tube of the green gold, one of those colors I strongly recommend. Your other option would be the primary yellow, the primary blue, and try to mix to get, it would have far more yellow in it. So now I took that, and I'm going to pick some of that color I just mixed for the trees, because I want to slightly tone and subdue that green that I just mixed. And I don't really see it in this photo, but I know from so many other photos that I have sort of what happens when I look at tree lines in the background. So I'm just looking at a variety of, and if I was there, I would have noticed there was a little bit more green back there. And actually, I don't need this to be upside down anymore. So I'm going to just work back into that a little bit. And since that tree line is not completely regular, I'm just going to feather at the top a little bit. So I'm pulling some of that green through it. I'm going to let it go through some of those branches or the trunks I just put in. I'm going to dip a tad into my black. It's going to darken that green. And that way as I work down towards that bank. And notice I am not trying to cover the whole thing, because there's a lot of growth on that bank and it's showing up through a whole lot of trees. And so I'm just going to work that through. I'm also not really worrying about those branches I painted in. I just wanted to get a sense for myself of where that tree is going to fit. So notice, I always get a kick out of going to exhibits or meeting people and they're like, oh my gosh, they look like photos. Take note, you're not trying to paint the photo. The photo is your reference. The joy of being a painter is that you're using pigment that is suspended in a liquid media. You're doing something that is synthetic. It's not at all about a photo. The photo is simply a tool you're using. So now I've got a little bit better sense that there's some kind of a embankment back there. I'm going to take that same yellow I have. I'm going to mix in take a brush load of the primary yellow into that green gold, the neutral that I've been working with. And I'm going to grab some. Remember, you don't thin the paint with water, so I just keep going back into my palette and grabbing some of that glazing liquid. That's why I sort of put it all around the surface of the palette when I'm setting in the color. So I'm just going to put some more on there because I can see I'm running low. I just mixed a pretty strong yellow-green. I'm just going to come up here. Now I'm using the edge of my brush. I just took it and I sort of flattened it a little bit. Sometimes that works really well when I'm just trying to get that sense of the foliage. So in places back here it is catching light. And although a lot of this will disappear behind those leaves, the foliage of that middle tree, I still can see that some of it is going to show up. So I'm just going to suggest where I see that variety happening. And once again, notice I am not trying to work like I'm a camera. This is loose. The term is painterly or gestured. I'm trying to think, how do I see, how do those branches that are sticking out beyond that bank that are catching some light, what's the sort of feel of them? So that might be enough, because back in here it really does just get completely lost. However, now I have a color on my brush that I see is appearing in that water. So I'm going to change the direction. I'm moving my palette this way. I'm moving my canvas this way because when I'm working with water, I'm constantly aware of that plane, of the pattern, because the water is filling to a flat receding plane. Reflections are going to travel on that plane. Reflections both from the sky, from whatever is nearby, in this case that overhanging tree, and there'll be places where if the water is shallow you start to see through it to whatever is the stream bed. The less movement, the more clarity. The more movement, the more you see distortion that relates to the direction of the flow. This is a pretty placid stream. There's not incline, it's not flowing down, so there's not a lot of breaking over rocks as it moves. So this part of why I picked this, or why I used this as one of the options, is it has water, which is a great challenge, but it's not, it doesn't have some of the other specific challenges that are more difficult in water. So now I'm looking at my water and I see that the green from that tree above is catching in the surface of that water. What I just put down is not reading very well, so I'm grabbing a tiny bit of white because I want it to be a little more opaque. And, there we go. So all I'm doing, since I see that there's a little bit of probably movement in that water, there's some visible surface, could just be that even it's breezy, but there's a variation, so it's not absolutely smooth like glass, which means as I'm beginning to indicate where that light green from the tree is reflecting, I'm going to do it in strokes. So I am not doing random marks. The way I could load the brush by spinning it, but in this case, since I know I want just that one kind of line, I'm loading it almost, I'm pulling it through so I get this nice flat kind of trough almost, because I'm going to just bounce it. I don't need solid lines. You see that reflection keeps moving back, it just gets less. It's a little more staccato, the lines themselves. Staccato. Anybody who played an instrument can try to remember what staccato means. This almost where I'm bouncing the brush with a less than regular kind of rhythm. And I'm looking, so I'm using my photo as a reference. Again, I'm not trying to copy it. I see a fair amount of that green. So I'm going to take some of that reflection the whole way through. And I'm looking and I'm thinking that's probably enough for now. I'm doing this thing that anybody who's had me for class, I can still get a brush to last for a long time, but I tend to do something that some teachers will say, don't do this, it's bad on the brush. Your choice. So I'm pushing it down and I'm moving it like that. What it does is it separates the brush out, it sort of fans it. Because I do see that back here there's going to be some greens that just show up a little bit through that tree. Once again, I'm not worrying about the branches. I can always paint those back. I just want to, those were a reference to help me start thinking where that tree is going to fit. There we go. I've got that in place. I'm looking, I see some darker greens in there, so what you can do is I can go back to my primary blue. I took a brush load of that and put it into the color. You're going to be like, looks like a Kelly green you might use around St. Patty's Day. So I'm going to go into the brown again. I took a brush load of brown. That starts to subdue it some. I'm going to dip into the ink. And voila, I have a really dulled, dark green. Take a brush load of that, the gloss glazing liquid. I'm doing that same thing. I loaded that brush to a point. I'm looking over here and I see there's lots and lots of these darker greens. These are relating to what is in the density of the tree here. So you remember, whatever's happening here on the water is happening here. So I'm going to just bounce this around, start suggesting where there's going to be a variety that shows up in that water. So I'll shut up for a bit, and you can just sort of, sometimes watching is more instructional than listening. This is that edge eventually of the brilliant green grass. So again, I'm not worrying if I paint into it, because that's closer to us, so I'm going to be painting that last. I'll go and grab a little more of that brown, tiny bit more of the primary blue, because I want this to have a little more saturation and a tad more black ink. There's no formula to this. I'm looking at the color I'm mixing, and I'm looking at the color that's there, and I'm seeing what do I need to convey that basic sense. So I'm going to build that dark. right now, there's going to be a lot of white that comes into this, or sky, very, very pale blue. I can only paint one color at a time, so I'm doing this dark, primarily because I had the light on my palette, and I thought, well, let's just use what we got. So I know there's going to be a lot of sky that'll reflect through. You can see that lots of these greens, again, very staccato, little stops and starts. So I'm just going to work some of those in. This green, luckily, this darker green flashes all through the water. See actually some of that little sort of cool reflection that happens where you almost feel that rhythm of the waves switching back, or I'm sorry, of the surface texture switching back and forth on itself. Can't quite say we have waves in the Carroll Creek. If this gets to be tedious, you want it to move along, you can go in the controls there at the bottom, sort of mid-bottom right, and you can speed it up. You can do 1.25, you can do 1.5, you can even do 2 times. So that what it does is suddenly makes me become a speed painter. But sometimes I do that when I'm looking through these videos. So I'm going to just keep painting. I see there's some really darks. I just dipped a little bit back into that ink. And I also see that there's some rhythm. There's a little bit more movement that is evident down here. So what I'm doing is I'm almost doing overlapping, broad, almost elliptical. And if I was on paper, so what I'm doing now, those brush strokes I'm doing, it's easier to see on paper. I'm just going like this, and then I'm coming right back through them. And sometimes I'll soften it. I'm opening it now up into much bigger curves. And I'm doing the same thing, taking those curves back. And that sometimes, if I see that really active area, this can be a good start. And then you start picking out highlights in darker areas later. So I'm just going to work that kind of a movement through down here. I also see on that side it's getting a little tiny bit duller, so I just picked up some of the light yeah, I should have had the tubes over here to be giving you the exact correct name of the color, but the light ultramarine, let me grab the tube. So light ultramarine blue is one of those optional colors you have. It's one that I also use, not to the extent of that green gold, but it's a color I use pretty much. So I just picked up a little bit of that, and I'm mixing it in with that green that I have, and what you're going to see is it grays it down. It dulls it a little bit. So I'm going to move that through what I already was doing. This way for a second just to see. It'll change the feel of those lines because I see a lot of, and I'm now just opening the size of that. A tiny bit of white in there because I want these to be a little more opaque. And all I'm doing is moving some of those lines through. Only because I know there's going to be more movement I get closer to that shore, closer to the bank. Take a tiny bit more of that primary yellow again. So I see as the color moves into the sun, it is paler, warmer. So that yellow with just a tiny touch of white. This color is really subdued at this point. I'm gonna come in here and the same thing. I'm gonna go, I'm looking at that. As soon as I put it down, it's not, it's a little too blue still, so I put a little more yellow in it. Okay, that's better. So I'm just gonna work some of that through. About finishing the painting. I'm doing more layers, I'm getting more happening each time I work into it, but I'm not trying to say, oh, this is going to be when I finish the painting. Okay, so what I need is a very different color up there. One of the optional colors you had is a transparent yellow. Went in, I really completely lightened that color by pulling in some of that adding a little water to thin because the paint's starting to get a little tacky. It means it's just drying a little bit. Pulled some more of the glazing liquid in to help me. Ah, that's what I wanted. There's a lot of light starting to catch on those back banks. So I'm going to go a little bit more white yet again. A little more of that primary yellow. Letting that sort of come down and overlap through those darker colors that I have. Moves over here, the water stills a little bit, so I start bringing those strokes into being a little just bit more horizontal. I'm doing my thing with my brush again to create that sort of fan of some individual bristles. And I'm just going to use that to my advantage because I see a lot of that basic flow of those fine ripples going across the surface. Pick up more of that yellow. You see it's really, really warm green as it moves closer to the other shore because of the light that's coming behind the tree and hitting the water back there. So I did that thing again. Pull some of that through. And that's the color I see a lot in the tiny spaces that are visible behind the leaves that I'm going to be filling in. So I'm just going to work some of that in right now. So this has come some distance in terms of finish from when we started just whatever that would be 15 or 20 minutes ago. I'm popping some of these through. So when I look at that image, I see that water is really active. So I just loaded that brush, did a slight spread, and I'm just going to bounce some of this value through. So once again, there's no, in art school, nobody taught me, to my knowledge, nobody taught anybody, these are different things you can do with your brushes. The idea is you just want to stay open and fluid and experiment. What I'm doing isn't necessarily original to me, but in the same sense it wasn't something that anybody ever taught. Instead I just started playing around and I'm comfortable with experimenting. Ah, look at that nice light. So while I'm bouncing some of these in, before I clean that or dunk this brush, I'm just going to get some of those possible lights in there too. I see on this side there's a whole lot of stuff happening. So I might as well just take that to my advantage. Remember, you do something you don't like, it didn't ruin the painting. You can always paint over it. But don't not try something because you are convinced it'll ruin a painting. There is no ruining the painting unless you abandon it or sort of lose touch with what you're doing and just sort of give up. Okay, so I think that's enough. Yeah, looking at it, that's enough for now. Let me get rid of that. I'm going to stay focused on the water for a moment. And that might be what this sequence of painting is about. We may just close this up after the water, and that gives you time to just keep messing around. So I grabbed yet another script. You know, a lot of those. Wouldn't have had to be one this thin. I could have worked with something like that. If you don't have one of those, I could do all of this if I wanted with one of these flats, because I can load that to a thin top and use the lines this way. So I have a variety of these scripts, so I'm going to use this script for now. So I get the brush wet. I'm going to take a nice, and it can be, I'll show you good habits, and then you can develop bad habits on your own. So I'm going to grab the white off my palette with my knife, because I'm going to be working on that sky. I'm just going to grab a tiny bit. I mean, barely. I don't want to get any of the green that I sloppily let happen over there near that blue. So first I'm going to put a little bit of that blue in, because the sky is not, what's reflecting is not as brilliant as the sky. So I look at that and I'm like, that's pretty good. Take some more of that glazing liquid. That is believable. I'm going to tilt my canvas again, just because I find these strokes easier to make than these strokes. So I'm going to look where those lights are, and I see a lot of light back here. So I'm going to just start back there, and a lot of this is going to get buried in behind my foliage, but I want it to be believable. So tap, tap, tap. When I look, it's not absolutely even. There's some movement obviously to the surface of the water back there, so I just see some places where the light is catching, is flicking on the top of that pattern of the water. I can also do that thing where I just smash a little bit and then I get all these lines. And what I like about that is I don't have as much control. Very often I like allowing a little chance for accident, because if I get too much control, then the whole thing starts to look, for me, a little too static, a little too, so I've got this big old mess, and it's not going to absolutely behave for me, but I'm still going to have some fun. Oh, I like that. Ooh. So if you look, oh, I'm not getting much control at all, and that is not a bad thing, because instead I'm getting a little bit of a cool spontaneity with some of those marks that I'm making. I'm clean that with water because my paint is getting really thick. And put a little more of that medium back in, that glazing liquid. I just loaded it again. I didn't make it quite as crazy as it last time. Now I'm looking and I see really strong light. You'll see that as it moves down towards that other shore, the one closest to me, the bank, it starts to almost follow the pattern as it's getting through some masses of the leaves. So I'm going to start suggesting that. I see. So I actually want to begin to suggest the fact that what I'm really doing right now is painting where the light is getting through this heavy canopy of tree that is right above that surface. It's closer to the tree, a lot more light, because here's the mass of the tree, the light is hitting behind that tree, so I'm seeing a lot more of this surface reflection. I just shifted back to that single sort of point. And I'm trying not to make them all just big, even lines. Dipped in that water again. A little bit of the medium to make sure I'm keeping it viscous, but I don't want it to be, when I'm trying to get, especially if you're working with a script, I want to have a little more control. So as I move over towards, and this to the left of the painting, there's a little bit more of the blue that is showing in the water because I'm not quite in the full sun at that point. So I'm just going to use my brush. And even though I have my paint coated with the medium, it's starting to get a film over the top of the little daubs of paint themselves. So I had to sort of work in to find, pierce through and get some of that fresh paint. So that's a lot more blue. And I'm going to keep dabbing. So once again, I'm going to be quiet for a moment and I'm just going to do a little bit of painting based on what I see. I want there to be a really brilliant contrast of light against the edge of that rock. So I'm letting those areas where that pattern of the water surface, I'm letting it go right through the rock. I can paint over and therefore get that really crisp contrast of the overlapping dark shadow of the rock with the flickering water behind it. We're back to having that little bit of a erratic movement in the water. I'm going to show you something else I tend to like to do. It's again not an organized technique, but it might work for you as well. So I put some strokes down there. I'm going to grab one of these. Let's see, I can even tell you what it is. This is a Dick Blick Studio Bristle Egbert. Egbert is the name of this just sort of insane, out of control top. And I buy a lot of them. So I'm taking this Egbert. Notice that is not a precision brush. Well, it's also because I've been using it and sort of beating it up. This paint is still a little wet. I'm going to just take that Egbert and I can either drag it with that bristle down or I can drag it on the side, which is called Scumbling. And I'm just pulling it right through what's there, just to soften that edge a little bit. A lot more of this blue is showing up through here. So again, I can take this Egbert, and I tend to do this. I tend to take it down. Sometimes I'll just bounce it, or I'll just bounce it and sort of be pulling it. You see that that's, as I move towards the other bank, I'm getting closer to the density of those trees. So there's more and more shadow and less light that is actually managing to make it through. So I'm just going to enhance that a little bit, and once again I'm going to do my little just having some fun. I'm not worrying about necessarily following that photo so much as just using what I know is the pattern of that water. And I'm going to just play around on here because there's a lot of, I can just see a lot more movement and a lot more areas where that reflection is catching the sort of swell of the water. So I just pulled that through a little bit more. And this might be one of those areas. You could try this. I could go right with the pattern a little bit if I wanted. I can just drag this through so that that pattern I'm suggesting just gets drug along. Again, that planar horizontal. Okay, I'm going to take even more blue and just do a couple strokes here that look like they're really optically catching a lot more of the crystal, the actual brilliance of the blue in the sky. And I'm just looking where I see those. Okay, at this point I'm almost ready to take a break. I'm just looking to see if I was going to do anything else. And I tend to like overlapping. Whatever is going to be painted over something, I'd rather paint through it, and then when you paint it, these immediate foreground, the paint will physically overlap what is already supposed to be spatially behind it. I can see some places where that water is catching a little bit more light, so I'm just going to enhance. I'm going to grab another brush. There's another color that shows up where the water becomes more shallow. I see more of what's below, that 16 or 18 inches of water. I can actually start to see the brilliant sun catching the stream bed. So I'm going to just suggest that to begin by mixing a nice pale. So I'm going to go to a little bit of my brown. And I'm starting to run out of space on my mixing palette. There's two optional colors that I recommended. One is just cadmium orange, so I'm going to take a little of that. It's an expensive color, but you don't use much of it, and it really is helpful. So there, I just want cadmium yellow with some of the umber that you have, some of the brown that you have. And I'm going to take just a tiny bit of that sky into it. I'm looking over at because there's a slight blueness to it. So I'm going to take some of that glazing liquid, just a tiny dab of my ink. That's going to be the darker, one of the darker. So I'm just going to start to in the same kind of pattern. I'm going to work that through a little bit where I can see some of the darker shadows from the stream bed would show up. And I don't mind that it's actually catching into some of the not fully dry colors that I've already worked in. So I'm not stressing this. I'm just getting a little bit of that color through there. And it's really visible only in this where it's closer to you, and that's where that underpainting is doing some of the work for me, because I'm seeing some of that yellow of the underpainting through there. I'm just going to get a little bit of that show through. Then I'm going to lighten it, so a little bit of white. If you didn't have the cadmium orange, then what I would do is on a separate area I would mix a lot of the primary yellow and a very little bit of the primary magenta and try to get an orange and be mixing that in with this. So I'm going back to my cadmium orange. And I've got a pretty brilliant, pale, sort of orangey dough skin. I'm going to put a little bit more white in it. And all I'm going to do with this is I'm just going to suggest where I know I see some of those reflections, where the sun is catching and hitting that stream bed a little bit more distinctly. And I'm just making some strokes for where I'm going to allow that stream bed to sort of sparkle through here. And little tiny flashes of it happen even out. And you can also just do that. Okay, so for now, I'm going to pause. So I'd suggest that you work through the water, relax doing it. If you want, this is a big tape down piece of canvas paper, but if you want and it makes you more comfortable, you can just do a small piece or cut it in half, have that there, and then be experimenting. So if it makes you really nervous to be doing strokes directly onto your canvas, go ahead and just experiment on one of those ground in place pieces of canvas paper or watercolor paper that I encouraged you to buy. So let's get to that point, and I'm going to wait a day or two and I'll do another video where I go right back in here. And the next thing I would work on, because we're working back to front, I'd make sure I'm comfortable with what's going on in this back bank. So I've got to suggest the rockiness and all the roots. And at that point, once I would have the bank and this water worked pretty much to where I think it's 80%, then I would start building in the foliage. So you work on the water. Next time when I come back, we're going to work on that back bank, maybe enhance the water a little bit, and then begin the first steps of bringing the tree in. The tree, the foreground will be like round, if this is round 2, that would be round 4, and then sort of going back into it and an overall focusing on clarity and detail of those things which are closer, that might be round 5. So we're going to come back at this a couple more times. And again, this is working in this particular technique I favor called glazing. You're working to achieve then a similar look to the sharper focus that I favor. So that's the technique we're learning in this workshop. You may develop and very quickly realize you like a softer focus or a heavier texture, which is called impasto. But we're working through in this really traditional glazing technique, which aims towards a sharp focus realism. Okay, really good. I'll see you again shortly, a couple days.